So originally, in many different civilizations, I don't want to say like since the dawn of time, but almost since the dawn of time, people have thought that political authority derived directly from God, okay? So the picture was something like this. God would look down upon the earth and pick a leader, pick a king, and give all the political authority to that king's family in a lot of traditions. There was like royal blood that sort of, the king's like inheritance would get, etc. This was really popular. This was thought for many, many years. And it wasn't even until the Enlightenment, so until like the 16th, 17th century, in the Western tradition, that these ideas were really started like getting seriously questioned, right? A guy named John Locke, not the guy from Lost, sorry. All my references are like 5 years back, so forgive me. A guy named John Locke, who's a philosopher, wrote a little book. It was called On the Principles of Government, or a treatise on government. There were two parts, principles of something and something else. Anyway, John Locke wrote this argument, right? And in this argument, he said that political authority isn't bestowed from above. Rather, it already lies in the people that are being governed, right? And so legitimate political authority is not the sort of thing that someone can claim and say, God chose me, and now I have the authority to make you do whatever I want, right? He said, no, that's just not how it works. It's not how it works. There were some other thinkers at the time. You may have heard of like social contract theories. This is all in the air at the time. A lot of people thinking about this kind of stuff. The idea was like political authority is here, and we have the power to tell you whether or not you can govern us, right? And in what ways you can govern us. It's a really radical thought. It was really radical. And it was also very theoretical. It was very abstract. He made this argument, right, in two different parts of the treatise. Then, about 100 years later, there's a guy called Thomas Paine, wrote Common Sense, a treatise on common sense, something like this, having to do with common sense. And in this pamphlet, he basically applied what John Locke said generally about political authority to the American political situation, right? He said, look, you guys, King George says he's got all this power over us, but it turns out it doesn't just come from God. It has to be legitimately, from the people, and for the people, and with the people, and I don't know exactly how that goes. So he wrote this. This was like the equivalent of a New York Times bestseller. People were freaking out about this pamphlet, right? Wherever you got pamphlets, like they were carrying this, and people were just like, wanted many of them. About a year later, on July 3rd, I think, I don't know, don't Google that. July 3rd, I think, Thomas Jefferson took that argument that had come from Locke through Paine, and he wrote a declaration, right? Declaration of Independence. You guess I'll get it by now. This declaration, think of how insanely revolutionary it was. It said, King George, you think you have divine authority? You think that God picked you, and you think you can do whatever you want to the people in America? No, that's not how it works. We declare independence. Legitimate political authority belongs to the people. And this group of people says you don't have it anymore. That's insane. Like, I want to pledge allegiance right now. That's amazing. Like, I'm getting chills just thinking about it. That's crazy. And my only point is, it's kind of a simplistic point, but my only point is, this revolution, what we live in today, started with a philosophical argument that John Locke sat down and wrote on a piece of parchment paper with a quill pen in the cartoon history in my brain. That's exactly my point, right? Philosophical argumentation, written philosophical argumentation can literally change political realities. It can literally change the world. All right, it's my inspirational bit for today. So remember last time we talked about argumentation and philosophical conversation. Today we're focusing on argumentation in philosophical writing. This is St. Jerome, by the way. So if you're wondering who this is, St. Jerome, he's writing the Vulgate, which was the Latin translation, the first Latin translation of the Bible. Before him, I think it was all in Greek and Hebrew. I don't even know. I don't know history. But yeah, so that's St. Jerome. And he has a skull on his desk as like a reminder that he's about to die, right? So if any of you like find writing papers difficult, just get a skull and just be like, oh my God, I might die. I better just, that's very effective. That's what I do. Good. So today, what's the plan for today? First, we're going to recap what we learned, and I'm going to do this in 68 seconds. It's going to be really quick, okay? Somebody can time me. And I'll win a prize if I get it in 68 seconds. Then we're going to talk about philosophical writing. We're going to talk about the argumentation game, which you've all seen in the packets. I'm going to re-explain it just very briefly. And then we're going to have some brave, cold-called volunteers play it for you live here. Then you're actually going to get to play it, right? It's going to be awesome. So let's look at the recap. So what are the elements of argumentation? Remember, we defined an argument as a verbal or textual attempt to establish the truth of some claim. We decided this had to be sort of precisified in a way, clarified in a way. And so we said a claim is just a proposition or an assertion that can be true or false. We came up with the following more precise definition of argument. It's a verbal or textual attempt to establish the truth of some central claim by means of more basic claims. There's our example. All of this is in your handout again, so if you sort of need a refresher, just flip back to like page 2. What is the aim of argumentation? Arguments just aim to establish the truth of some claim, or to persuade some others to believe that that claim is true. And what are the tools of argumentation? We gave you 3 of them: clarification, objection, and support. I'll run through these a little bit later, so I'm not going to pause for a ton of time. But any questions about what we've already covered that you think, I just need to know this before we get to the rest of class today? Any questions like that? Awesome. All right. Argumentation and philosophical writing. Philosophical writing, this is why this lecture is going to be a lot shorter and a lot more simple than the last lecture. Because philosophical writing, it's basically just philosophical conversation with 2 differences. The first is that it's written down. Easy enough. And the second is that it's generally presented from a single point of view. I wanted to mention, too, you may have learned in AP English. I learned in AP English, or like a rhetoric and composition class or something like this. There are a bunch of formal rules of writing. This is true. But one of those rules that someone once told me is you can never use personal pronouns or first personal pronouns, right? You can never say I believe X and I'm going to argue for it in the following way, right? And so all of my papers were filled with these awkward linguistic constructions. They were one may believe that one thinks arguing following ways. It was terrible. You don't have to do that, okay? Maybe in other classes, I don't know, probably not. You can just write in your own voice for everything in this class. And in fact, this is a really rhetorically effective technique, especially if you're writing something like an op-ed, right? Or the apology assignment. In fact, you have to write the apology assignment in the first person, right? Because you're writing it about you and about your beliefs. It wouldn't make sense to say one may have the following system of beliefs. That'd just be silly. So not only is it from a single point of view, but it can be from your point of view. Good. All right, so let's look at an example of philosophical writing. And let's sort of look at the argument in that writing. We'll sort of apply some of the tools. We'll make sure it's super clear. Okay. So here's the example. Can somebody read this example out for me really loud? Not really loud, just audibly for the whole room. Yeah.
It's often said that we live in a society that is too politically correct, and I agree. However, the remedy to a problem is not always its opposite. Instead of self-consciously cultivating politically incorrect attitudes or spewing offensive and hateful rhetoric, we need to figure out how to make spaces in which our political discourses take place safer for well-thought-out but countercultural disagreement. Here are 3 suggestions for how we could do this.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. You have a great reading voice. You should do audiobooks. It's great. So can somebody tell me what the central claim is, right? What's the main claim that appears in this sort of fragment of argumentation? It's kind of an op-ed style example. What's the main claim? Okay, that our society is too politically correct. Perfect. There we go. Yeah. The main claim, as I've identified it, is that we live in a society that's too politically correct. But you might wonder immediately what that means, right? What does it mean for a society to be too politically correct? Well, luckily, we have some argumentation tools that we can apply. First of all, you might think that sort of the text in red here helps to clarify the sentence that I've underlined. So again, think about what it means for the remedy to a problem not to be the opposite of that problem. To flesh that out, you might say something like, instead of self-consciously cultivating politically incorrect attitudes or spewing offensive and hateful rhetoric, etc., we're clarifying that first claim, right? And you might think that that claim that we're clarifying is a way of further clarifying and supporting the central claim, or the main claim, right? Which is that we live in a society that's too politically correct. I think, too, just looking at this example, I think there's sort of two parts to the main claim, too, right? The one is that it's often said that we live in a society that's too politically correct. The other thing, though, is that there's sort of a way that we ought to remedy that situation, right? And that it's not by going to the other extreme, if you will. So there's sort of a middle way. Okay. So we saw how we can bring clarification into our philosophical writing and how that can help make the argument clearer, but also help support it. If you look at the phrase that's in blue here, this phrase also uses one of our other tools that we gave, right? Which is that it anticipates and responds to a common objection. So you might think, if you're just a reader, right? If you pick up the New York Times and you open it up, the op-ed is sort of a response to political correctness, right? You might think that an objection that will immediately arise in the minds of many of your readers or your audience is going to be, look, we already live in a society that's too politically correct. We don't need more political correctness. So in order to stop that objection right where it's starting, you can say, I'm not advocating for political correctness. I'm just saying that there's a middle way between extreme political correctness and extreme political incorrectness, right? Or the sort of rhetoric that sometimes gets used in response to political correctness, right? So there are all kinds of tricky ways in which we can provide support by responding to objections that might arise, by giving other more basic claims, by making the main claim more precise, that sort of thing. So you'll see a lot of the tools are sort of used at the same time. Okay. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some advanced strategies in philosophical writing and argumentation more generally. And I have 3 of them for you. Again, these are on your handout. So the first is you can appeal to different kinds of support or evidence, right? So here's the example. Christians should want to protect religious liberty out of self-interest. Liberals out of a sense of the value of diversity and plurality, and conservative non-religious people out of a mistrust for government discrimination based on ideological identities. So can somebody tell me what sort of op-ed might that phrase appear in? What might the main argument be in that op-ed or in that argument? Yeah.
An argument for the protection of religious liberty.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, can you say even more about sort of how this illustrates the first technique of appealing to different kinds of support or evidence? How's that supposed to work?
Well, they're arguing towards different groups of people and like appealing to their interests. So like they're appealing to Christians, liberals, and conservatives with 3 different reasons to support the main claim.
Absolutely. Thank you. One thing that's really interesting about this is you might think there's no one person that's going to accept all of these more basic claims, right? In fact, you might think that you can't be a Christian, a liberal, and a non-religious conservative person, right? You might think like those identities aren't compatible. They kind of are in some like weird ways, not all of them, but like, aspects of something. But you might think like, why would you give an argument that appeals to different kinds of support that it would be impossible for any individual to accept, right? You can't accept all of them. And the idea here, right, the first advanced strategy, is just that by doing that, you can broaden the scope of your argument. You can support your main claim by appealing to different kinds of reasons that will appeal to different people in your audience, or different audiences altogether. So that's one thing that you can do. The second one is you can turn objections into support. So for instance, while my opponents have argued that we must discriminate on ideological grounds, this is sort of keeping with the same theme, the same kind of an op-ed, in order to keep America safe, I would argue that a danger far more severe than the extremely small physical threats his cases bring to mind is an ideological policing that would threaten the very notion of liberty itself. It's kind of an extreme example, sort of grand. But how does this example illustrate the second advanced strategy, turning an objection into support? Well, basically, it argues that my position, right, as the writer, pretend I'm the writer, my position better accounts for the criteria that my opponents put out in the first place and said, this is the thing that we should care about when considering this particular topic. We should care about safety in America, right? And I say, that's fine. I totally agree that we should care about safety. But what does safety mean? Does it just mean eliminating any possible physical threat ever? Or does it mean protecting basic liberties, basic rights of American citizens? You've taken an objection and you've made it support your case. Finally, you might want to use clarification to identify and eliminate disagreements, right? So here's the example. Those who argue that we ought to discriminate based on ideological grounds, that is, by screening Muslims at the border, for instance, are perhaps better understood as exaggerating the common sense proposal that we ought not to let anyone into the country if they have concrete and well-formulated plans to do violence to U.S. citizens. So again, here, by clarifying what the central claim of my opponent might be, I can just eliminate disagreement from the outset. Maybe I can't, right? Maybe the opponent, it really truly is claiming that we ought to discriminate based on religious grounds for some other reason. But by making the claim more precise and charitably attributing it to your opponent, you might find that there's not really any disagreement in the first place. And this can give people reasons to accept your arguments, or to accept that you've established the truth of your central claim.